To Remote the Connected Faculty Summit. My name is Dan Barrett. I'm a senior editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, there are a few things to note. On the left side of the screen, you'll see a panel with a few key tabs. One of them is chat, which allows you to interact with your fellow attendees. Another one says questions, and that one enables you to submit your questions for the speaker to answer at the end of the presentation. So feel free to do that while the presentation is happening and afterwards. And slides and other related resources can be found in the Handouts tab, and there should be a link there already. If you need to, you can resize and rearrange the panels on your screen just like you would a browser window. Click the icons on the bottom of your screen to open or close additional panels, such as speakers, bios, abstracts, share, and often handouts. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be available to watch on demand after the event. And now on to the discussion.
Hi everyone, and welcome. I'm Judy Brooks, and in this session we'll be taking a look at evidence-based practices for creating multimedia for learning, more specifically instructional videos. So in one of my favorite roles in the Eberly Center, I consult with faculty on the design of instruction and using technology for education. And in our current context of remote hybrid teaching, more and more instructors are turning to video. And so now I hear, I'd like to leverage or I'd like to use my Zoom lectures or recreate those Zoom lectures to have students watch those outside of class. Now, the key word there from my perspective is watch. Watch indicates a really passive experience for students. I mean, do we really expect that students will watch a 50-minute lecture or number of 50-minute lectures and maintain motivation and be able to attend to the details, to the key information that you want them to attend to? So then, how does video work for learning? How can we leverage those assets? How can we make it efficient for instructors to translate the materials to online? And how can we make it efficient and effective for students to learn with? And so with that in mind, I'll introduce you to one of my colleagues in the School of Design, who I've been working with for many years now. And he has an instructional video that he created. Again, this was a little while back, and he came to me asking for some feedback. How could he make this better? And so with that, let's get started. This is Peter, an instructor in the School of Design, who is introducing a topic and providing students with the context for how to approach the assigned reading. As we examine this 2-minute video, consider these questions. How is this working for learning? How could it be improved? And what questions does it raise for you about good uses of instructional video?
Okay, so this is a third reading on the three means of persuasion of Aristotle, and this is a special reading for the grad students, although I think all of you would benefit from reading it and thinking about it. And so it goes in depth into what are the means of persuasion according to Aristotle, and what role does logic play, what role does the character of the speaker play, what role does the emotions that are aroused in the audience play with regards to persuasion. And so as you're reading the text, try to think of what are counterexamples of design products or designed experiences or services that have been designed. Think of how would you translate what you're reading about rhetoric to design practice or experiences that you've had with design products. So how does a character of a designed product play out in the world? Some of the questions that you might have is what do we mean by character? Right? So some characteristics of character are things that you sort of can deduce by the appearance or the background of the speaker. Some aspects of the character of a designed artifact you might deduce by the materials that it's made out of. You might also think of Character as in what actions does that designed artifact take into the world? In what conditions was it made? How were the workers that made that product treated? Were they paid fairly for their work, or were they working under really bad working conditions? And so these are all conditions that have to do with the character of the designed artifact. What imprint did that designed artifact leave behind, or what character does it, what world does it make moving forwards?
Okay, how do you think that worked? Well, here's some things that went through my mind as I was watching. First, I thought it was really great that he was motivating the topic and making ties to relevance for the students. Also, guiding the students' reading is a really good idea. Otherwise, they're reading with their own novice perspective, not really keying in to the things that he'd like for them to key into. And I was thinking that, wow, he looks really tired in this video, and what is that bed in the background? So for the first few seconds of this video, I was really distracted with that. And then there was also a lot to hold in memory. As he was talking, I was trying to make connections, and so when I first watched this video, it was very difficult for me. And then, is there another way he could have done this video? Could he do a worked example for us? How he would read through the paper with those questions in mind, and what he would note, what would his practice be? And generally, I was wondering, is this a good use of video for learning? If you are using video as a teaching strategy, it needs to align with your learning objectives and assessments. What's the added value beyond something like readings? Some good reasons might include as a way to synthesize many sources, or there's no reading available, you're teaching something that is cutting edge, or to provide expert perspective, commentary, examples, or to demonstrate something, model expertise, how you analyze an image, how you solve a problem, similar to what I was thinking about for Peter's. So here's a set of use cases provided to help you identify ways in which video might be a good match. And please, if you have additional use cases to share, feel free to add those to this Google Doc. As you read these, consider what use cases resonate with you most. What's their potential value for student learning? What types of learning objectives are well aligned with each of the use cases? Peter's goals for his instructional video included setting up the conditions for students' active learning, and specifically, to provide students with a critical lens with which to approach the assigned reading. So how can he improve the video to better meet those teaching and learning goals? Here are a few considerations. What is foundational is how we process information, and short-term working memory has limited capacity. There are differences between novices and more experienced learners, and what they retrieve from prior knowledge stored in long-term memory. There are some strategies we can leverage to address these constraints and affordances of how these systems work. Let's take a closer look. Everything hinges on the affordances and constraints of how memory works. We have working memory and long-term memory, and in long-term memory, we have our prior knowledge. Working memory is where processing of new information happens. And it happens as a result of information we bring in through our senses, what we see and what we hear. These are separate channels for processing information, visual information and verbal information. These channels, working memory, can become easily overloaded. So what happens, for example, when we're reading? Brain imaging research has shown that the part of your brain that's active when reading is the same part as when you are listening to someone talk. So when reading, your brain has to do double duty. Meaningful learning occurs when a learner builds coherent mental representations in the verbal system and the visual system, and builds systematic connections between them. In facilitating the learner's knowledge construction and meaning making, we need to take into account these two challenges. The goal is to get information into long-term memory and connect it properly to your prior knowledge. But these challenges get in the way of that. So when creating multimedia for learning, you want to minimize these challenges. So the key idea here is not to overburden the channels. Let's try a demonstration. There's a body of research that looks at attention and cognitive load. These 3 treatments are what you will find compared in those experiments. Which of these 3 do you predict would lead to the best learning gains? Okay, let's test it. I'm going to show you a 2-minute video now, and we'll ask you a few questions afterwards.
By practicing tongue twisters, you can improve your diction and public speaking. A tongue twister is a phrase that is designed to be difficult to articulate properly. Some produce a humorous or vulgar statement when mispronounced. Others are funny simply because they're hard to say without making a mistake. Here's an example from the book Elmo's Tricky Tongue Twisters, featuring the Muppets. Baker Betty Lou bought some butter, but it made her batter bitter, so Baker Betty Lou bought some better butter to make her bitter batter better.
Okay. Can you remember why it's important to practice tongue twisters? If not, try to recall, where was your attention focused as the video was playing? Is this what you predicted? The best practice here is to minimize text when talking and to use images to convey concepts as much as possible. When just spoken word plus images, you're minimizing the interference of the channels and managing cognitive load. The written words are interfering with our ability to listen and integrate the audio content. How could we make this video better given a do-over? I've included in the Google Drive, for your use, a rubric that we've developed for evaluating the effectiveness of multimedia for learning. Feel free to adopt or adapt it for your use. And now, let's look at some best practices and a few examples. Students naturally build sparse knowledge structures and might not see the connections and relationships that you as an expert see and want them to identify and apply. To help with this, you can create a big picture view for your students and use it repeatedly to promote rich structure. Support efficient use of working memory by focusing attention. I'll bubble up 3 key design principles for the purposes of this session. Eliminate extraneous content, make sure that text and graphics are integrated, and use verbal and visual cueing. Let's start with eliminating extraneous content. An example I'll use is the Betty video redesigned in a storyboard format so that you can see how some of the extraneous content has been eliminated and things have been sequenced. So the first thing I'm doing is bringing the instructor into frame with only the question, what is a tongue twister? The instructor speaks the response to that question and then ties back to students' prior knowledge by asking, do you recall a tongue twister from when you were younger? Let's see an example. So now the instructor pops up this other example and says, say this phrase as fast as you can. Did you put an SH sound in the word cells or she sure? And here's the motivating question. Why are we practicing this? There's the response, and the voiceover connects it to real life, saying tongue twisters are used by actors, politicians, and public speakers who want to sound clear when speaking. And next, the learning goal is stated, and the voiceover says, let's listen, and then we will practice. And the instructor speaks the tongue twister that students are about to practice. Next, the tongue twister is presented, and the students are asked to give it a try. They are also asked to repeat it many times until they have mastered it. So this is a sequencing that is deliberate, and it is basically taking students from an explanation to an example to hearing how to do it, and then to doing it themselves. And the main piece of extraneous content that has been eliminated here is that visual. The visual was purely decorative. And so in that sense, I did not consider that as something that was focusing attention, but rather dividing it. Next, let's consider the spatial arrangement of visual elements on a page and how that works for learning. This is an eye tracking study of people looking at graphics with separated or integrated text. The more we have to take time to find the relevant or related information, we are taking precious resources from working memory. An integrated display makes this more efficient, makes the salient connections, and supports better learning as a result. Our next example will be a demonstration of integrated text and graphics, as well as provide you with strategies for cueing, for directing and focusing attention. How do you want to direct the learner's attention through process visuals or other complex information displays? There are a variety of ways to do this. One is through explicit signaling. The other is through goal-directed behavior with focused outcomes. In the storyboard I just presented, that one was working through goal-directed behavior. This next example is an explicit signaling through the use of highlighting and cueing where the learner is supposed to look. But first, reduce the complexity as much as possible. What is the essential information here? And what should the learner attend to first, second, and third? By reducing complexity, you give the learner a way in. You make efficient use of their limited working memory. By speaking to each element versus speaking and displaying the explanatory text, you reduce the potential for overload. This provides the learner with the opportunity to integrate the visual and verbal representations into long-term memory. So instead of displaying additional text, verbally explain how the student works through the cycle. You can reveal or unpack things over time so you can reduce the complexity even further. Once students have the big picture, you can focus attention as you unpack each step in the process or explain key components of complex visual diagrams and or highlight key relationships among them. Using signals like circles and pointers can help to guide the learner's attention to key essential information. If necessary, layer in more information over time as students become more and more familiar with the base concepts. The use of instructional video for students' learning should be an active experience, not a passive one. You can do this by explicitly connecting to the learning goals and providing clear descriptions of what students will be doing. At a minimum, ask questions verbally, make it conversational, and better yet, intersperse interactive questions and responses to those questions. Leverage worked and partially worked examples. They are very good for making expertise visible and for students' development of mastery. Connect it to another activity that students need to do to develop their understanding of new concepts. For example, a discussion that follows up, or connections to the reading like we had started off with. This next example is a video that the instructor curated aligned with the goals for her Managing People and Teams course. This particular video is also tied to the readings and a case study that the students will be engaging. I've intentionally saved the best example for last. I think you'll get a kick out of it.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, it's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. So he gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
Good uses of video are active and done well are an effective use of technology to enhance learning. So with that, I'll leave you with this famous Herb Simon quote. Learning results from what the student does and thinks, and only from what the student does and thinks. The teacher and the technology can advance learning only by influencing what the student does to learn. Thank you.
Hello, welcome back. Thank you very much for that presentation. A few quick follow-ups. Thank you for all the questions pointing out the lack of the handouts tab. Actually, the slides, the slides might be made available later on. Is that correct, Judy, if you can revise those?
Yeah. I'll add those to the Google Drive folder.
Right, and if you check in the chat thread, there are a number of posts where there's a link to a best practices document and a rubric document. In addition, there are also a number of questions about whether video will be made available. We'll try to get some clarity on that as well. I'll start with a first question here, which is how does instructional video connect to classroom activity?
So when you're doing instructional video, it's not operating in isolation. You want to make those explicit connections between the video, the interaction that students have with the video, some sort of conceptual checkpoint, right, to get them prepared. Oftentimes it's used as a pre-lesson prior to doing something in class. But it's always connected, and students should know that it matters that they're watching it. And so you want to make explicit connections between what they're doing outside of class and inside of class, and video is no exception. Furthermore, if you're doing something like classroom assessment techniques where you're trying to figure out where students with respect to their learning, is there a gap in their learning? You can actually use the video lecture or the video format as a way to fill those gaps. If you identify gaps that students are experiencing through a classroom assessment technique, you can actually use your video as a response to that. And that way you're not taking additional time out of class time necessarily, if it's maybe even just for a few students. So it's a good way to fill the gaps.
There's a question here about, I don't know if this is about our presentation today, but I imagine it also relates to multimedia presentations. What do you advise faculty in terms of providing closed captioning for accessibility?
So for closed captions, typically, yes, you're going to want to provide those. Now, if the video is within your institution and within your Canvas course, for example, it does take a bit to create closed captions. The general rule of thumb is you want to make all of your materials digitally accessible, period. End of story. However, if you are busy and you're trying to provide a quick video, and you know it's for your students in your class, and you know that you do not have someone who needs an accommodation, you could delay the making that accessible. But general rule of thumb is build it into your timeline. There are tools that you can use for making things captioned. YouTube, you could upload your video to YouTube, caption it, it gets an approximation. You fill in the rest, edit it to make it 100% correct, and then you can make that available to students. So general rule of thumb, yes, if you find yourself in a pinch, make sure none of your students need it. or use a different mechanism for providing that content.
Great. Thank you. A question here also. What is your best recommendation for reading to follow up on video as active learning? I guess the question is, what recommendations do you have for readings that are about using video in active learning? Are there good sources that you would recommend?
Oh, okay. A good portion of what this is referencing is the information from the Clark and Mayer research, Multimedia and Principles for Learning, and Ruth Clark extends that further in terms of building expertise. And so there are a couple of books that I think are really good reads with respect to that. And then there's the active learning literature, but I don't have sources handy. I can make those handy and put those in the Google Drive folder. There are some on the sources of those documents in there as well.
Great, thank you. Another question from one of our viewers. How long is the ideal length of an instructional video?
So generally speaking, you're wanting to keep it within 5 to 7 minutes. I did not exhibit best practice here because we had a format to follow, and this is more of like a presentation type of instructional video. I was feeling very meta and also very concerned about how it would come across. But the idea there is 5 to 7 minutes, and then you do something. So you'll notice that within the video, I was trying to simulate that to some degree by prompting questions, by having folks think about what would you select, things like that. And that's that's a totally fine way of doing things, I think. But generally speaking, 5 to 7 minutes, get that conceptual chunk done, and then have students, practice with that information. Is it a discussion board? What is it? And you can curate video. You don't always have to create it. So that last example was an example of curating a video. Those students read a case, they watched the video, and then they had to submit a response to the case and discuss. There's another example that same instructor does where they watch a video of two teams practicing or doing an exercise, and they do an analysis of two teams and how they're doing. And then they go off and actually discuss in a discussion board and predict how are these two teams going to turn out. That actually leads to their midterm team evaluation. So there's a series of events there, a case study, watching two teams and analyzing them, how will they work out, and then actually assessing each other in their teams. And so you have a nice series of active learning around video there. It's actually around multiple instructional materials.
Great. Thank you. A question here, I think it's about the use of slides when presenting video. I often need the text on the slides to remind myself about, I think, the point that I'm trying to make. How do I prompt myself without using extraneous text that interferes with students listening?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we have needs when we're presenting and teaching, and your students have needs too, and those are definitely in tension sometimes. Of course, the presenter notes, now with Zoom, it's really hard to use your presenter view in PowerPoint, but you can actually use a portion of the screen so that you could still keep your presenter notes up in front of you. That's one way that I would consider doing it. So I do recognize that tension of needing to present and also making it appropriate for your students. I hope that helps, but I don't think I have a quick answer for that. I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. The production value of the two examples you showed was quite different. What would you tell faculty members who, maybe have production capacity that's more like the first video than the second? Is it still worthwhile to do something like that, even if it's not, with the live audience reaction that gives it a sense of energy?
Yeah, we have a saying in our office. It's pedagogical fidelity, not production quality fidelity. It needs to be good enough that the channels are clear. I can hear you and I can see what you need for me to see. In terms of lighting, it's nice to have good lighting. It's good to have good lighting. I want to be able to see you. I want to be able to relate to you. I want to see the whites of your eyes, for example.
I'm sorry, Judy, I'm going to have to interrupt, but I think that's all we have time for right now.
Okay.
Sorry, I
All right.
asked that last question.
Sorry.
So thank you again very much. Thank you all
You're
for
welcome.
joining us. And please be sure to explore the event to access more valuable resources from our sponsors and network with peers. Thanks and have a great day.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Bye.